Hi everybody, welcome back. I'm Seth Monahan, the guy who makes these theory videos, and I'm delighted that you made it all the way to number 12 in my series on classical harmony and counterpoint. Today's video seems to have something of a grammatical theme because we're going to be learning about things called sentences and periods. Now, if you happen to already know what sentences and periods are, then you'll also have figured out that I'm apparently a big old liar, because this video isn't actually about harmony or counterpoint at all, and neither is the next one. Instead, we're going to take a break from harmony to make our first foray into musical form. More specifically, we're going to look at two of the most common small forms in the classical style. Forms that are usually only one or two phrases long, depending on how you define phrases. On the whole, most will last about 8 to maybe 16 bars. Now, the features that define these small forms, which we're obviously going to pay close attention to in this video, are repetition schemes, which is to say, how and when the opening material comes back later in the form, and also the type and number of cadences. So let's start with sentences. To get us rolling, I want you to listen to two instances of sentence form, and I want you to try to figure out what they have in common in terms of these defining traits I just mentioned. In other words, how they use repetition and where they place their cadences. The first is the opening of Beethoven's very first piano sonata in F minor. And the second is the very famous opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in C minor. So now that you've heard them both, let's go back through them with an eye on what makes them sentences. The essence of sentence form is that it begins with a short idea, usually 2 bars long, maybe as much as 4 bars long, and that idea is repeated, usually over a change of harmony. And we see that right here. Beethoven gives us the opening motive, which is over the tonic harmony, and then he repeats it, which is over the dominant harmony. Together, these two repetitions make up the first half of a sentence. This is sometimes called a presentation. Now, the second half of a sentence is usually much more continuous. It's less clearly broken up into chunks, and it always leads to a single cadence, in this case, a half cadence. So let's listen again now, and as we do, try to tune yourself into that characteristic short, short, long rhythm that makes up the sentential organization. Now, there's one more thing I want you to notice, and that's how harmony works here. Have a look at Beethoven's bass line. The opening idea happens over the tonic, and then the bass moves down by semitone to scale degree 7 for the repetition of that idea. So we have it over the tonic, and then over the dominant, and then back to scale degree 1 in the bass for the second half. This is actually a remarkably common pattern. Basic idea over the tonic, repetition over the dominant, and then the second half starts on the tonic again. Keep your ears open for that. We're going to hear it a lot in this video. Basically, everything we just said about Beethoven's piano sonata applies to the symphony as well. We have an idea. In this case, it is a 4-bar idea. This is a big symphonic work. Repeated, and the second half drives to a large half cadence. Let's have a listen. Two additional points about this one. One is that we see this scale degree 1, scale degree 7, scale degree 1 bass line again, delineating the first idea, the second idea, and then the third part of the sentence. The other thing is that this sentence and the one before it do a thing that Beethoven likes to do a lot, which is to build up momentum and intensity in the second half of the sentence. That's not a required feature, but Beethoven really likes to sort of ramp things up and drive toward that cadence with a mounting intensity. We hear that in both of these examples. We don't hear it, however, in this Mozart example. This is from his E-flat major piano concerto, the last movement. And once again, we get the short, short, long formula. Once again, we get our 1-7-1 bass line, basic idea over the tonic, repeats over the dominant, second half starts on the tonic again. But this one ends with a PAC, not a half cadence. This is actually important. Sentences can end with any type of cadence, not just a half cadence like the ones we saw in the first two examples. So let's listen. So switching gears a little bit, here is a sentence that reminds us of a point we learned in video 11, and that's that actual classical textures by no means require you to have 4 voices at all times. This is the opening of Mozart's first G minor symphony. It's not the more famous one that he wrote much later in his life. And the whole thing, the whole sentence unfolds just as a melody presented in octaves, this bare, gloomy octave melody. But there's harmony clearly defined here. You can see that he starts with arpeggios in each bar, and it ends with a half cadence, unmistakably a half cadence, and the 1-7-1 bass line, tonic, dominant, tonic, is also implied here as well. So as we listen, tune yourself into these similarities to the past examples, even though we actually don't have any harmony here literally at all. So before we turn to period form, I want to look at just a few more sentences to make just a few additional points. Here is the opening of Beethoven's third piano sonata, which you may remember from our last video. Well, now you're in a position to recognize this is actually a sentence form, one that ends with an IAC at the end. And I also want to point out that this one also uses an interesting harmonic cliche at its opening. Instead of presenting the whole first idea over tonic and then the whole repetition over the dominant, now each of those statements has 2 chords. The first idea goes from tonic to dominant, and the second one goes back from dominant to tonic. Now, if that opening harmonic pattern feels vaguely familiar to you, 1 going to 5 and 5 going to 1, you're probably remembering it from any number of songs you heard as a child. Take the birthday song. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming you've had a few birthdays, and if you have, you know that the song begins as a sentence. It starts with an opening motion of 1 to 5. That repeats, going back from 5 to 1. And the second half is much more continuous, takes us to a cadence. The song If You're Happy and You Know It also uses exactly the same pattern. 1 goes to 5. 5 goes back to 1. PAC. We see pretty much the same pattern in the opening of Mozart's G major piano sonata, although now Mozart inverts the dominants instead of having them in root position. And before we hear it, I want to just point out that this is an example that reminds us that sentences aren't always perfectly symmetrical. Instead of 2 plus 2 plus 4, as in the past ones, we have 2 plus 2 plus 6. So the second half is a little bit longer, finally getting to a PAC. Now, the past few sentences have been pretty small, but to give you a sense of just how big they can be, here is the opening of Mozart's later, more famous G minor symphony. This is a giant sentence. The opening idea is 4 bars long, and it actually divides into 2 small parts of its own. Plus, and then that itself repeats, and then the continuation leads to an enormous half cadence at the end. So the whole thing in the end is 20 bars long. And finally, I included one more short sentence just to remind you that sentences don't need to stay in the same key. This is from Beethoven's C minor violin sonata. This movement is actually in C major, and it simply modulates from the tonic C major to the dominant G major. Have a listen. Okay, now that we've got sentences under our belt, let's turn to periods now. And it's going to be the same drill as before. I'm going to play you 2 of them, and I want you to listen for what they have in common in terms of both cadences, how many, what kinds, and important thematic repetitions. The first is from Mozart's F major piano concerto. And the second is from Haydn's Symphony number 93 in D major. Now, I hope you noticed two key features in common here. The first is that each divides in half with a cadence at each end. The first one's a half cadence, the second one is a PAC. This is sometimes called an interrupted tonal design, the idea being that the first phrase was somehow cut off before it made it all the way to tonic, so that we have to start over again. The second thing to notice is that each of the two phrases begins similarly. This is often referred to as parallel design. The music we hear at the very beginning returns after the cadence. And the two phrases themselves have special names. The first leg of a period is called an antecedent phrase, while the one that follows is called a consequent phrase. So as we listen again, I want you to focus on how the second phrase complements the first one, coming after the open-ended half cadence by reinstating the opening tune and giving us much stronger closure at the end. And we see the same thing in the Mozart that we looked at first. There's an antecedent phrase that ends with a half cadence and a consequent phrase that ends with a PAC. These two excerpts are examples not just of periods, but of a special kind of period called a parallel interrupted period. Parallel because the opening of the two phrases are identical, interrupted because we start at the tonic, we get to a half cadence, then we restart on the tonic and head to a full cadence. It's probably the most common type of period in the classical style, so for good measure, let's hear just a few more of these before we look at a few other period types. Here is a very low-key parallel interrupted period from Haydn's Opus 64 string quartets. The antecedent phrase ends on a half cadence, while the consequent phrase ends on a PAC. So these phrases are each 4 bars long, and it's worth noticing that usually antecedent and consequent phrases themselves do divide roughly around the middle. An antecedent is often not just one continuous idea, but a kind of 2-bar idea followed by 2 bars of something else, which nevertheless don't have a cadence that divides them. Now let's check out this much more energetic period from the opening of Haydn's Symphony number 102 in B-flat major. Once again, antecedent phrase ends on a half cadence, consequent restarts in the tonic, goes all the way to a full cadence at the end. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are other types of periods, and we're going to look at a few of them now. But what you need to know first, though, is what makes them periods, because they're going to be different in some respects from the parallel interrupted period. To be a period, writ large, a form must have 2 cadences and thus a minimum of 2 phrases. A period is essentially a pair of phrases that combine to form a bigger, more coherent whole. However, the types of cadences and the precise harmonic organization can vary pretty widely. So here is a compact little period from the finale of Mozart's C major piano concerto. And it's similar to the parallel interrupted sort, except that the antecedent ends with an imperfect authentic cadence rather than a half cadence. But as with the interrupted sort, it's balanced out by a stronger PAC. The next excerpt from Beethoven's C minor piano concerto reminds us that periods, just like sentences, don't need to stay in the same key. They can modulate to a new key. Notice here that the antecedent ends on a half cadence, as so many of them do, but the consequent phrase finishes with a PAC in the key of the minor dominant. This is not a half cadence because we're on a G minor chord. We fully modulated to the key of G minor from the C minor at the opening. Another variable with periods is the harmony that starts the second phrase. So far, all the periods we've seen have been exactly parallel, with the opening music returning at exactly the same pitch level. But have a look at Mozart's late D major piano sonata. Here, the cadence layout reminds us of a parallel interrupted period. There's a half cadence at the end of the antecedent, PAC at the end of the consequent. And the antecedent, predictably enough, begins on tonic. However, the second phrase starts a step up on the 2 chord. And the effect is that the second half feels like an intensification rather than a simple re-beginning. And here, in the minuet of Mozart's famous dissonance quartet in C major, we see something similar. The antecedent ends on a half cadence, consequent ends on an authentic cadence, but now the initial idea, which first appears in the tonic, comes back upside down in the dominant. So when you listen, I want you to notice how the whole period is basically just a big 1 to 5 to 1 progression. And I also want you to hear how elastic the idea of parallel design is. The consequent phrase transforms the opening idea pretty thoroughly, but it still leaves it recognizable. And for that reason, I think we could still call this a parallel period, even though it's starting to strain the edges of what we could take as parallelism. Now, so far, all of our periods have had parallel phrase openings. They're starting to get a little bit less literal here, but there's still a parallelism. It's worth noticing that some people think that this is actually the essence of period form. For these people, if you don't have parallelism, you don't have a period, you have something else. But others more recently have argued that 2 balanced phrases can still be a period, even if their opening phrases contrast with each other. Here is the opening of a famous Haydn piano sonata, very clearly antecedent and consequent phrase, ending on a half cadence, and a PAC. And notice that the phrase openings, although there's some similarities, the accented notes and so forth, there's really nothing like a parallelism here. This is an instance of a contrasting period. I'll give you just one more example of a contrasting period. Here's the conclusion of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, and we've got the same cadence pattern we keep seeing over and over again. Antecedent ends on a half cadence, consequent ends on a PAC, but notice the phrase beginnings are totally different. First one begins with this, and the second one begins with this. But when you listen, see if the 2 phrases still have that kind of balanced, complementary relationship that we saw in parallel periods. I feel that it does. So that is a contrasting period, and we'll see those much less often, but they are out there. Still, our main concerns here are with sentences and parallel periods. So let's review those 2, specifically how to tell the 2 apart. Basically, we've seen 2 distinct repetition and cadence schemes. Let's suppose you're looking at an entire excerpt, which I'll just represent generically here with a bracket, and let's call the red X a cadence that ends it. One way we've seen such a span organized is that we hear an opening idea that returns about halfway through after a cadence. In the other scheme, there's an opening idea which comes back immediately without a cadence, and then proceeds to a bunch of other stuff and only ends with a cadence at the very end. Hopefully by now you can recognize these 2 schemes. The first of these is the parallel period, and the second of them is sentence form. However, I don't want to give you the impression that sentences and periods are always completely distinct from each other because, and I want you to watch carefully here, a parallel period might just be made up of 2 sentences. And very often, those sentences are of the parallel interrupted type that we saw early in the lecture. So let's go back to the opening of Mozart's early G minor symphony. This is the one whose opening sentence was all just played in octaves. If we widen our view a bit, we discover that this sentence is actually just the antecedent phrase in a giant parallel interrupted period, whose consequent is also a sentence, and ends, of course, with a PAC. So let's listen now. Now, I'm sure you noticed that despite the parallel melodic design, the consequent phrase actually contrasted quite a bit with the antecedent. Rather than a quiet unison, it was a full orchestral forte. That's one of Mozart's favorite tricks, the understated antecedent and then the full-throated consequent phrase. We also see this in the finale of his Symphony No. 39, which again is a parallel interrupted period made of 2 sentences. The opening of Beethoven's C minor violin sonata uses this same trick of intensifying the consequent phrase while keeping the parallelism of melodic design. And here, he seems to have learned a lesson from Mozart's G minor symphony in that the sentential antecedent phrase is spare, quiet, gloomy octaves, but the consequent phrase adds the violin and breathes some energy into the piano texture, even though the whole thing retains a quiet dynamic. And Beethoven uses the same trick in his Opus 87 oboe trio, which uses a quiet sentential antecedent and a loud sentential consequent. Of course, I have to point out that not every sentential period uses this kind of intensification effect. Here's a theme from Beethoven's Second Piano Sonata, and it's a very compact sentential period. Antecedent ends on half cadence, consequent ends on PAC, same dynamic level throughout. So our last topic, and the bridge to the next video, is what's called an asymmetrical period. We get one of these when a period's consequent phrase is longer than its antecedent. Sometimes that consequent phrase is expanded from its middle. Consider the finale of Mozart's First Piano Sonata. Here we have just a regular old 8-bar parallel period. But that's not actually what Mozart wrote. I edited that. Here's what he wrote. Notice here that there's 2 bars of extra stuff in the middle of the consequent phrase where the music just sort of chases its tail for a few moments before moving on to the cadence. So the 4+4 balanced period has been slightly skewed by the introduction of extra material, so now it's a 4+6 asymmetrical period. Another, and maybe a more common way of making a period asymmetrical is to extend the consequent from its end. This often involves a technique called cadential evasion and extension, which just happens to be the topic of our next video. So I look forward to seeing you there.